Welcome to Fantasy Forecast Central. This week on the podcast, we will have Sigmund Bloom on the show. He's the co-owner of fantasyfootballguys.com, and he also is the NFL lead writer at Bleacher Report. We'll ask Sigmund what he thinks of Rashad Jennings as fantasy playoffs start here. We're also going to have Rich Hribar. He's a fantasy contributor over at xnsports.com. He also contributes to numberfire.com. He'll give us his take on Josh Gordon's dynasty value here for the 2014 season. All that, our fantasy playoff start sits, and much more just around the corner. This is Fantasy Forecast Central.
Time now for Fantasy Forecast Central Radio. Here's Nick Slegel and Brian Dzelski.
And welcome to Fantasy Forecast Central, Week 14. My name is Nick Slegel, and as always, my co-host is Brian Dzelski. Looking at some fantasy news from Week 13, Josh Gordon became the first player in NFL history to go for back-to-back 200-yard receiving games. This is so impressive coming from a guy that, missed the first two games of the season, has had to deal with Brandon Whedon, Jason Campbell, Brian Hoyer. He's already the number 2 fantasy receiver in the league. My thing here is, impressive as this has been, how did Megatron really never have back-to-back 200-yard receiving games?
Well, let's cool our jets here. I mean, Megatron doesn't have back-to-back 200-yard games, but he does have a 300-yard game.
That's true.
And he does have, I believe it's 6 200-yard games to his credit over the course of his season. So, with Josh Gordon, there's really nobody else to throw to in Cleveland. And, you look at Jordan Cameron, he's kind of fallen off the last month or so. So Josh Gordon is basically the guy getting looks in Cleveland. And with the way the NFL is these days, Nick, it's an absolute air show. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is just the beginning of more to come. I mean, we got Alshon Jeffrey, another second-year receiver who's posted his second 200-yard game of his career and of the season. We just saw Eric Decker, who we're going to talk about in a minute, catch 4 touchdowns. He almost hit 200 yards. So the NFL is obviously shifting to a major passing attack, and Josh Gordon is a prime example of what we're going to see here going forward in the NFL.
Yeah, and just a crazy stat to sort of try to put things in perspective about Gordon. In only 26 career games with the Browns, he's already their 4th all-time franchise-leading receiver.
Really?
Another 10 games
That's
at this
awesome.
rate. Yeah, it really is. Another 10 games at this rate, he will literally be the team's number 1 wide receiver of all time. He's going to hit that mark hopefully within, the first 8 weeks of his 3rd NFL season. That is just insane. And, the Browns ever get a real quarterback, like a legit franchise quarterback, I just can't even imagine what this kid could do.
Yeah, and I saw somebody post on Twitter, must have been last week, it was before the games, somebody posted who they thought was their best. It might even have been Ryan Riddle, who posted the question asking who the most talented second-year receiver in the league is, and it was obviously Justin Blackmon, Alshon Jeffrey, or Josh Gordon. And I think he might have had a list of other guys. Michael Floyd was in that conversation too. And man, I don't know who to pick in that situation. I mean, all these guys have come around. Michael Floyd later than these other guys. Michael Floyd's really turned it on here the last month. Justin Blackmon, I have to feel, Nick, is the most talented, but obviously the guy can't stay out of trouble. So for me, it's really Josh Gordon. I think is the guy out of that crew that you would want, isn't it?
Yeah, for me it definitely is. And I mean, I really don't think you could go wrong with Michael Floyd.
Or
Um,
Alshon Jeffrey.
yeah, Alshon Jeffrey, maybe even like Kendall Wright. I mean,
Yeah, there's
all
another one.
very very talented second year receivers that are gonna have long best careers. But I think. Oh, and even what's his face, Blackman. We can't really forget about Justin Blackman. Yeah, he's in trouble all the time, but he's really talented too. But I think out of the group, Gordon is the guy that I would have to go with. He's in another league talent wise. I mean, you look at those other receivers we talked about, Jay Cutler, even Josh McCown. I feel are way more elite quarterbacks than anyone that's been throwing Gordon the ball. Carson Palmer, obviously in Arizona, and even in Tennessee, Jake Locker more so than Ryan Fitzpatrick. But even then, both of them still better quarterbacks than anything in Cleveland. So I think we have to go with Gordon here because he's turning in a fantastic season with almost no support.
Yeah, and it really is. People have beat this into the ground, but it really does make you wonder what Cleveland was thinking if they really were wanting to trade this guy. I mean, good for them that they didn't, because what he's doing now, is absolutely amazing, and who knows where that offense would be without Josh Gordon. I mean, but to think that that was even a topic of conversation for a period of 3-4 weeks there, right around the Trent Richardson trade, is just absolutely mind blowing to me.
Yeah, it really is. Speaking of receivers that had big weeks, Eric Decker, we just talked about him a second ago, sort of disappeared all season. We hadn't seen much from him in weeks. Goes off for, like you said, almost 200 yards, 4 touchdowns. He was clearly Peyton's favorite target on the day. My concern here, with all the weapons that they have, with Peyton's ability to spread the ball around, what do we think about Decker going into next week?
Well, I have a love-hate thing with Eric Decker, and look through the first 7 weeks of the season, 7-8 weeks of the season, he actually was having a really good season. Was it week 6 or week 7? He was actually leading the league in yards, in receiving yards. So he only had 3 touchdowns during that span, but he was having a fairly good year. I mean, Peyton Manning wasn't not looking his way. He was very, very right on par with Wes Welker and Demaryius Thomas and Julius Thomas in terms of targets. They were all pretty much even. But the last month of the season, he completely fell off. We talked about him last week, and he was one of my sits. I mean, he made me look like an absolute ass clown. I was telling all my friends, if you have Decker, sit him. The guy's got 170 yards over the last month of the season. Peyton Manning is just not throwing his way. I mean, why risk it? And here he comes out, $174 and 4 touchdowns. This week he faces the Tennessee Titans, who are the number 1 defense against opposing wide receivers. They allow the fewest points to wide receivers. So I don't know. I'm kind of at one of those situations. I have him in 2 leagues. I sat him in both leagues. I am fortunate enough to win both of those leagues, but I had mega points sitting on the bench. I kind of feel I might have to roll the dice with Decker because it is Peyton Manning, and that offense, obviously, it just seems like they can't be stopped. It's a home game, but it's one of those situations, Nick, where I am going to be, wavering back and forth right up until kickoff.
Yeah, and it didn't make you look that bad. Somebody from ESPN, I want to say it was probably Matthew Berry, for obvious reasons, tweeted out that Decker was actually only started in like 42% of leagues. So, a lot of people had given up on him, which is such a bummer because he was putting up mad points on most people's benches. I'm with you, though. The number of receivers that have, the way they spread the ball around, Julius Thomas coming back and being healthy, Sean Marino being able to get things going on the ground, I don't trust Decker ever. I don't say I would bench him or anything like that. I don't want to go that far, but if it's up to me, I'm steering clear of him, in my dailies and stuff, just because there's probably a better, more surefire option, and his price is probably going to go up given his performance this week. But that's just a brief look at some news around the league from this week. When we get back, we are going to talk to Sigmund Bloom from FootballGuys.com. You're listening to Fantasy Forecast Central.
Cigar fans, check out fifthdowncigar.com and enter the coupon code PFC to get 10% off your order. Lots of nice high-end cigars. That's fifthdowncigar.com. Enter the code PFC for 10% off your order.
We're back, and you're listening to Fantasy Forecast Central. Joining us now is Sigmund Bloom. Sigmund is the co-owner of FootballGuys.com, and he's also an NFL lead writer for Bleacher Report. Thanks for stopping by, Sigmund. We're excited to have you.
Yeah, it's good to be here, and everything's on the line now. It's do or die in every fantasy league this week, so now everything we say gets magnified.
Yes, and you know what? That's a perfect segue because our first question is actually about the fantasy football playoffs. Sigmund, they are upon us finally. Everyone, extra nervous about plugging in certain guys into their roster right now. Antonio Brown just seems to be one of those guys that are kind of in question. He only had 2 touchdowns through the first 8 games, but has scored 4 TDs in his last 5 games. Is he someone owners can trust this week against a Miami Dolphins secondary that has only allowed 1 touchdown to opposing receivers all season long?
You have to, partially because this offense in the last 3 weeks, it happened in the Detroit game. The Steelers really became a Ben Roethlisberger-centric offense, giving him a role a lot like Peyton Manning. It's his show to run out there. And I do think that even though he had a rough week, in fantasy terms, 5 for 59 is not great, but it was against Ladarius Webb. And Brent Grimes is a great corner in his own right. But you have to have expectations when the Steelers run no huddle that there are things that can break down when he extends plays. And the thing is, Antonio Brown has been 5 for 59, 6 for 50, 6 for 57. These have been his lowest stat lines all year. So he's really a very low risk play for wide receivers. We've seen even some of the receivers outside of Calvin Johnson, they all come up small a few weeks out of the year.
So given that Miami has struggled against the run, Le'Veon Bell is probably going to eat. Are there any other receivers from Pittsburgh you would count on in this game this week, or is Emmanuel Sanders a sit in your opinion?
No, I don't think Emmanuel Sanders is a sit. I think that Sanders, again, you see this trigger with the Steelers going to that Ben Roethlisberger-centric offense. He's got 6 catches and a touchdown in each of the last 2 games. And if you think that Brent Grimes is going to do a decent job on Antonio Brown, then Sanders may have some lesser coverage there. Now, going back to what you said about Le'Veon Bell really quickly, I do think that this could be a situation that you need to wait until game time. And Jordan Reed reminded us on Sunday night that when it comes to concussions, it's never a sure thing that a player is going to play the following week, even though most weeks they do play the following week. And this concussion in particular, even though he has 10 days to recover instead of the normal 7, because he was unconscious, I think that puts this into a higher danger zone. This is not a quote-unquote mild concussion, if there is such a thing. So I do think that because also Le'Veon Bell, the Steelers are 5-7. The playoffs are a long shot. Le'Veon Bell is a big part of this team's future. They're not going to mess around with him. So I do think that before, and the answer of who to turn to in fantasy if Bell's out is nobody. Don't even bother. But I do think that Le'Veon Bell owners need to be careful.
Okay, fair enough. And that's something we were going to touch on later in the show too. Jordan Reed kind of surprised us all being good to go all week and then having that headache, right before the game time. So it is something to really try to keep an eye on with concussion players moving forward. Changing the book a little bit here, Drew Brees and the Saints, very high-powered offense. Last night we saw them just get shut down by the Seahawks. This coming week now, they have to go up against a very, very tough Carolina Panthers defense that's allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing receivers and the 4th fewest points to opposing running backs. Is there anyone on that Saints offense owners can trust other than Jimmy Graham and obviously Drew Brees this week?
I don't think that you want to meddle with guys like Marcus Colston or Kenny Stills. I wouldn't be surprised if one of them has a good game, if Drew Brees can get the time to throw downfield. But I do think you hit on it with Graham and maybe the running backs. I know that Pierre Thomas and Darren Sproles let everybody down. But you have to remember the same kind of home field advantage we saw Seattle have last night. That's the kind of home field advantage New Orleans is going to have. It's a primetime game. This is a game to get a leg up for a division title and a bye. I do think you're going to see New Orleans bounce back and really draw a lot of energy from that crowd. And because Darren Sproles will be indoors on that fast track, you have to think to slow down that aggressive front seven. You have a lot of draws, a lot of screens, a lot of plays where you try to kung fu, use that over aggressiveness against them. So I do think that Darren Sproles could be somebody you might look at as a flex, especially in PPR leagues. The same thing with Pierre Thomas, just because he's the engine of the offense, but I wouldn't have high expectations because that front seven is so stifling.
We're talking to Sigmund Bloom, NFL lead writer for Bleach Report. This is Fantasy Forecast Central. Sigmund, as we know, running backs play a major role in fantasy football, obviously, especially here in the playoffs. With the return of Darren McFadden to the Oakland Raiders offense, what happens to Rashad Jennings' playing time, and are either one of those guys worthy starts against the Jets defense that allows the second fewest points to opposing running backs?
Right, to answer the second question, no, they're not, because of the Jets. However, I do think that doesn't mean that Rashad Jennings will be worthless. I do think Darren McFadden is basically somebody you would maybe put at the end of your bench in a case of emergency break glass type situation. He doesn't look fully recovered from his hamstring. He might be trying to end the season on a high note as he goes into free agency. But I believe that Rashad Jennings will be treated as the starter. I believe that he will get 15 to 25 touches, and we look at games against Kansas City and San Diego in weeks 15 and 16. Remember, Oakland is the only team that has really thoroughly beaten San Diego this year. I mean, embarrassed them. The game happened after midnight on the East Coast, so a lot of people probably didn't get a chance to see it back in Week 5. So I do think with Andre Holmes now adding a vertical element, and just to add another wrinkle to that question is, yes, Rashad Jennings is not someone you would want to play, but especially if you're a big underdog this week, Andre Holmes was beating Brandon Carr, who's one of the best corners in the league on Thanksgiving. So I do think that Matt McGloin has no qualms about throwing the ball up for him on 50-50 balls. So I do think Andre Holmes could be a sneaky play this week that gives you an equalizer opportunity against a better team.
Okay, Sigmund, we got one last question before we let you go. We know you're a busy guy. This past Sunday, we saw C.J. Spiller and Fred Jackson both have really good games. Now, what do you think owners can expect from either of those guys going forward? And are they too risky of a play here in the midst of the fantasy playoffs?
I don't think they're risky plays. I think that what we want to see is E.J. Manuel play a little better than he did against Atlanta. And you hope that the speed that they have, because what we've seen is the Tampa secondary, which Darrelle Revis is going to shut somebody down, but those secondary receivers are having big weeks against Tampa. So you would hope that the speed from guys like TJ Graham and Robert Woods and Marquise Goodwin will open things up and give CJ Spiller that runway to take off like he was getting against Atlanta. And then Fred Jackson just showing he's kind of blowing up expectations of running backs over the age of 30, where he's still got moves, he's still got power. He's been going through some injuries this year and really not slowing down. So I would say they're both flex plays this week. But where you really get excited if you own these guys, if you can get past this round of the playoffs, you get Jacksonville next week, and they can hopefully get you to the championship.
Now, if you own both of them, and a lot of people do out there, which one do you play? Or do you roll the dice and play both?
Yeah, I think you have to look at your lineup and you have to look at your opponent's lineup. And if you need upside, Spiller's obviously the guy. And then, honestly, even with Spiller a little gimpy last week at the end of some of his runs, watching him last week, it should terrify you to keep him on your bench. What you could miss out on if you don't play Spiller. Jackson's the safer play, especially in PPR leagues. He's getting at least 2 catches, usually 4 catches in most games. And he's getting the goal line carries, and when he's getting those opportunities, he's converting them. So if they can move the ball on Tampa. And remember, last week we saw Tampa, after 3 straight wins, turn back into one of the league's worst teams, and certainly a team having trouble stopping just about anything through the air. So if E.J. Manuel can be effective, that should open things up. So I think that if you need the safe play, it's Jackson. If you need the upside, it's Spiller. If I don't know anything about your team, I'm probably going to tell you to play C.J. Spiller because you always err on the side of leaving the talent in your lineup.
I have to agree with you. As much as Fred Jackson has actually scored this year, I kind of side with having to play CJ Spiller in that spot. Well, Sigmund, that's all we have for you today. I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show and talk some fantasy with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, guys, anytime. And, good luck to everybody out there, and just remember to dance with who brung you. Don't overthink it. If you got this far, your instincts are probably pretty good.
That's right. Always roll with your studs. Anyway, that was Sigmund Bloom, NFL lead writer for Bleacher Report and co-owner of Fantasy Football Guys. Make sure you check him out on Twitter at Sigmund Bloom. When we get back, we will be discussing some starts and sits. This is Fantasy Forecast Central.
Check out the official store of the Pro Football Central Radio Network at pfcshirts.com to get all your holiday shopping done and be the coolest kid on the block wearing your favorite show's official t-shirt. That's pfcshirts.com and get your swag on.
Welcome back to Fantasy Forecast Central. Right now we're going to go over some guys that you should probably definitely have in your lineups this week for the fantasy football playoffs, and additionally, some dudes you might want to avoid. Starting at the top of the list, Josh McCown. Listen, as a Packer fan, I'm all in on this guy. I've watched almost all the games he's played for the Bears so far. He's creating quite an actual quarterback controversy down there in Chicago. He's been just lights out in replacement of Jay Cutler. He's actually only turned the ball over in one game, yet, the fumble and the interception earlier this season. That's it. He's been just on fire. They're going up, at home against the Dallas Cowboys this week, who have struggled so heavily against opposing quarterbacks. They've given up over 3,700 passing yards and 22 touchdowns, and even almost 200 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. They're giving up just short of 20 fantasy points per game. I see no reason that, especially with the performance that McCown and Alshon Jeffrey put up last week, that the Bears behind McCown don't just torch Dallas through the air this week.
Yeah, Josh McCown is playing lights out football right now. Back-to-back weeks of over 350 yards, 2 touchdowns in each of those games. He's putting up fantastic numbers, and like you said, he plays the Dallas Cowboys, who give up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. It's a matchup that everybody needs to take advantage of, and you can feel confident that you're going to get somewhere in that 20-point range. Yeah, I'm with you there, man. I start Josh McCown for sure. Guy I'm looking at is a guy that I've kind of been hating on this year, and I've owned him in some leagues as well, is Torrey Smith. He's coming on as of late, actually. He's scoring 3 touchdowns here in the last 4 games that he's played. And this is after only scoring 1 touchdown in the first 8 games. But the Ravens, they do welcome the Minnesota Vikings to town. And obviously, everybody knows how bad the Minnesota Vikings are on defense, especially, against opposing wide receivers. So I'm all in on Torrey Smith this week. I fully expect him to be pressing 100 yards, and I wouldn't be surprised if he has 1 or more scores going into or this week. Excuse me.
Yeah, excuse me. Torrey Smith was a big guy I was quite high on early in the season, before the season in drafts, just because he was the number 1 receiver now. The Ravens do like to air it out. I thought he'd be a little better, but he's been a consistent producer for the most part, especially in PPR leagues. So I really definitely think he's a great start against Minnesota. Another guy, and we talked about this just a little bit with Sigmund Bloom here, if he's healthy, if he's ready to go, Le'Veon Bell against Miami. We know they're shutting down the pass. We know Ben Roethlisberger is still going to try to air it out and exploit them, but they're going to get their money done on the ground. The Dolphins are struggling against running backs. They've given up over 1,000 yards rushing, 10 touchdowns, a couple touchdowns in the passing game, and 500 yards in the passing game. They're giving up 19 fantasy points to opposing running backs. Le'Veon Bell could eat this week.
Yeah, he makes a really nice running back 2 option this week. And I know there are owners out there that are kind of worried about his yardage production. He hasn't rushed for over 80 yards in any game since week 8. Week 7 he rushed for 93, but his numbers have been down in the yardage department, but he catches a lot of balls out of the backfield. So PPR owners are really loving this guy. And he scored this past week against Baltimore, and he's got a really good matchup this week. So yeah, I'm all in. I'm right there with you with Le'Veon Bell. A guy that I'm looking at is another receiver, Nate Burleson. And I know last week he was shut out completely. I believe he only had one target the entire game, which is kind of crazy in a game that the Lions blew out the Packers 40-10 on Thanksgiving Day. But 2 weeks ago in his return, he came out, caught 6 passes for 77 yards and a touchdown. So I fully expect that this week against the Philadelphia Eagles, who give up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, I fully believe that, well, for one, this game is going to be a shootout going both ways. So every wide receiver that you can get your hands on in this game on both teams should be in the lineup. And I think Nate Burleson makes a nice low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 option here against the Eagles.
Yeah, against the Packers on Thanksgiving, we saw Chris Durham take, I think it was like 4 more snaps than Burleson, but Burleson actually had more targets. I think they were just trying to ease him in. He looked good. They're going to keep getting him the ball. So I think that's a good play against Philly, especially with them, trying to hopefully lock down Megatron. It's going to open things up in other areas of the field. Another guy I've been high on for weeks and weeks and weeks, and sometimes I hit and sometimes I miss, but he's been pretty productive lately, is Garrett Graham with Houston, the tight end, filling in for Owen Daniels. They're going up against Jacksonville this week. I remember 2 weeks in a row we said start this running back against Jacksonville, and Jacksonville just shut down the run. But they're struggling against tight ends. They're giving up the 3rd most fantasy points at just under 10. They're actually tied for the 2nd most. They've given up 8 TDs, which I believe is the 3rd most. Yep, 3rd most. Almost 800 receiving yards. Case Keenum likes to throw it to Graham. He could look to go to his way quite a bit, especially if Ben Tate can't get a ground game going.
Yeah, I can see where you would like Garrett Graham here, and I'm actually contemplating starting him this week I might have no choice if Jordan Reed doesn't go this week. I think he's going to, but if he doesn't, Garrett Graham's going to be my option. But Case Keenum hasn't thrown a touchdown in 2 weeks now, and 2 weeks ago against these very same Jacksonville Jaguars, Garrett Graham was held to 5 catches for 32 yards, so I can see where you would want to play him, and I know you've been high on him, and I mean, especially after that Oakland game, he came out like gangbusters, caught 7 for $136 or whatever it was in a touchdown. But he's kind of cooled off lately, so I'm a little hesitant to play him. But I can see where you would want to against a real weak Jacksonville Jaguars defense. Switching now to guys that we aren't so high on, guys that we probably would want to sit. And for me, it's not necessarily a guy you probably can sit. It's just a guy that maybe you want to be concerned about if you're starting him this week, and that's Andrew Luck. I know that right now Andrew Luck is currently the 7th highest scoring quarterback in standard leagues, but he has only thrown 2 touchdowns in the last 4 games versus 6 turnovers. And he faces the Cincinnati Bengals this week, who give up the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. I know he's probably most people's number 1 quarterback option here as we approach or as we enter the fantasy playoffs. But if there's a better option like we talked about earlier, Josh McCown, I would 100% play Josh McCown over Andrew Luck this week, just because of the trend that both guys are headed towards, over the last few weeks. So Andrew Luck is a guy that I am staying away from this week, Nick.
Yeah, I'm with you. That Cincy defense, gives me worries. Luck in general has given me worries lately. You said it perfectly. I would start McCown over him in a heartbeat this week, which is just that's a sentence that could have caused the entire fantasy world to implode week 1. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's just crazy to think about, but it's true. At this point, I'm starting Josh McCown over Andrew Luck this week in any leagues that I have him. Unfortunately, the next one really hurts me. Jordan Reed, dude, I've been so high on since coming out of college, just waiting for him to get his break with Washington. Got it. Performed so well. Now, like we talked about with Sigmund, that concussion. We don't know if he's going to be ready to go. He could be a game time scratch. Even if he does play, we don't know what his impact will be. So I'm saying sit him and or Fred Davis if Reed can't go. They're going up against the Chiefs defense, giving up the fewest fantasy points to tight ends, the second fewest touchdowns at 2, only 468 receiving yards. They are shutting down opposing tight ends on a weekly basis, and I just don't think RG3 is going to be able to utilize them properly.
Well, if you're a Jordan Reed owner and you think that you need to go out and get Fred Davis and start him, you obviously hate winning and you hate money. So you shouldn't be in the playoffs anyway. But yeah, I tend to agree with you. Like I mentioned earlier, I have an issue right now in one of my major big time leagues. I have Jordan Reed and Garrett Graham is my backup, so I'm not sure which way I'm going to go there, but I'm a little worried. Let's just put it that way. Guy I'm sitting this week, and I know he had a good game this past week. He caught 9 balls for over 95 yards. I think it was 98 was the exact number, was Anquan Bolden. He should be shadowed most of the day by Richard Sherman, and we all know what kind of cornerback Richard Sherman is. He locked down Anquan Bolden in week 2, actually, allowing just 1 catch for 7 yards. So I don't think Bolden's a great play this week. I know it's a home game for the 49ers, but I don't think that's going to change much. I do think Bolden's going to get more than 1 catch. You might see 3 or 4 catches for 30 or 40 yards, somewhere in that range. But I wouldn't expect much more from Anquan Bolden this week.
No, I'm with you. Short and sweet, Richard Sherman is the truth. I honestly avoid almost every receiver going up against him except maybe Megatron, and even then I'm really hesitant. Obviously, if you drafted Megatron, you can't bench him, but Anquan Bolden, you probably got it at a cheap enough value that it's not a problem to sit him this week. Another receiver, and we talked about this with Sigmund Bloom. I am a little different than Siggy on this one. He said, Emmanuel Sanders is still a guy you could play against Miami. I feel like if Le'Veon Bell goes, if they look to use Antonio Brown, I don't think Emmanuel Sanders is going to have an impact at all against the secondary. I say sit him this week.
Also, I know where Sigmund Bloom's going with this because Sanders does have 2 touchdowns in each of the last 2 weeks. But I'm with you, to be honest with you. I can honestly say I wouldn't be playing Emmanuel Sanders. Antonio Brown, that's a guy that you almost have to play with how hot he's been. But Emmanuel Sanders is a guy that I think you can find a much better matchup here in the playoffs, especially when, stakes are so high right now. I wouldn't roll with Sanders against a real tough Dolphins secondary. The guy that my last guy that I want to talk about here is not so much a guy that you probably can sit. It's more of a guy that owners should temper their expectations when playing him this week, because chances are the production is not going to be there, and that's Zach Stacy. I know he's played well. He's played his way into being a legitimate running back too, but we saw this past week what can happen, when the Rams face a dominating front seven. He ran the ball 19 times for 72 yards against the Niners and didn't sniff the end zone. And this week, Stacy will face the Arizona Cardinals, who give up the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. I want to say the number is 9.9 points per game to opposing running backs. You probably have to start him, like I said, but it's not a matchup right here where what you want to really have in the heart of the playoffs. But just owners temper their expectations with Zach Stacy this week.
Yeah, and here's another guy I've been all in on since the draft. Got him so low in so many leagues, just praying that he'd get his shot as the number 1 guy. He did. He broke out. He had some awesome games. Been slowed a little bit recently. Unfortunately, in the leagues I didn't have him in, as soon as he busted out, I bought high. I bought all the shares I could, and now, going into the fantasy playoffs, I might be screwed. I'm with you, though. He's a definite I don't know. It depends on, who you have on your roster. I'm honestly going to have to start him, and I don't even want to. But I'm with you. If you have any way to get out of starting safety this week, do it. He's probably not going to have the best game against Arizona.
I got a
So I
question
think,
for you
oh
because
yeah,
I'm in the same boat as you are, man. I have Zach Stacy, and my other options are Jordy Nelson or Victor Cruz.
oh my
I can
God.
put him in that. I can put him in that running back, wide receiver, flex spot.
That might be the hardest start sit question anyone has ever asked it. I mean, I think you have to go with Jordy.
You
No
have to
matter
go with Jordy.
Yeah, if you look
Okay.
at not even from a fantasy perspective per se, but if you look at Pro Football Focus's grades, even with the hodgepodge of crappy backups that have been throwing the ball recently, he's still the number 5 overall receiver in the league. He just gets it done. I like Jordy a lot. I'm not even trying to be a homer, but I think I'd have to go him, then Cruz, then Stacy. Like if I had
But
to
yeah,
rank.
Cruz and Stacy are both projected more points than Jordy, but Jordy and Victor Cruz both have really nice matchups this week. So
Mhm.
it's something I'm going to be wavering back and forth all week long, and it's obviously it's a tough decision.
Well, and I think too we'll be watching Packers news conferences today, tomorrow, throughout the week because obviously, if Rodgers comes back, Nelson is the no-brainer there, right?
If Rodgers is in, yeah, I'm playing Jordy Nelson. But if it's Matt Flynn or Scott Tolzien, I don't know if they've named either one of them the number 2 or number 1 quarterback. I know they're still wavering back and forth on Aaron Rodgers right now. But obviously Matt Flynn did himself no favors this past week, so who knows who they're gonna throw out there this week. But that's all we have for starts and sits this week. We're going to step out here for a couple minutes and pay the bills, and when we get back, we will have Rich Hribar on the phone. This is Fantasy Forecast Central Radio.
Football fans, check out ProFootballCentral.com for all the latest NFL news and analysis. Also, check out the very popular Pro Football Central Radio Network for awesome NFL talk around the league. Go to ProFootballCentral.com. ProFootballCentral.com.
Hey everyone, check out TomahawkShades.com and get your lethally stylish pair of sunglasses. Great quality for a great price. Shades on, problems gone.
We're back. You're listening to Fantasy Forecast Central. Right now, we're joined by Rich Hribar. Rich is a fantasy contributor to xnsports.com and numberfire.com. We appreciate you taking some time out to join us. Rich, how's it going?
Doing great. Good to talk to you guys. Definitely. It's here we are on week 13. Already in December, man. Comes and goes.
Yeah, I was writing an article last week, and I was thinking about it. I was like, man, this season went fast. And I'm sure we say that every year, but it really feels like we were just getting excited, for preseason games and the start of the season, and then boom, we're in fantasy playoffs already. Like, this is crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why we love it, though, because we don't get enough of it.
Exactly. It's never, ever enough for us. Josh Gordon has had a monster of a year. We talked about him a little earlier on the show. He's established himself as the number 2 fantasy wide receiver despite missing 2 games and playing with the likes of, Whedon, Jason Campbell, Brian Hoyer, just a hodgepodge of not-so-talented quarterbacks. Looking ahead at dynasty drafts next year, where do you see him getting drafted? Talent alone says he's a top 5 pick or a top 10 pick, right? But with like the looming threat of like a lengthier suspension and all that, does that hurt his value at all at this point?
Yeah, I think a little bit to owners that values that element of it. But as far as pure talent goes, I mean, he's definitely in that discussion. The top 5 or 6 receivers, and it just becomes like preference after Calvin Johnson. Dez, Julio, Demarius, and AJ Green. He's right in that group, though. Other than that, you're going with who you prefer. I like him a little more than Demarius long term. He kind of slots in at like that wide receiver 5 for me. Once Peyton leaves, I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen there. So, I mean, that's where I'm going to slot him right now is at wide receiver 5. And someone like me, especially in Dino startups, I'm going to trust the wide receiver over running back because, the careers last longer and it's more stable.
Rich, what does Josh Gordon's value do if the Cleveland Browns go ahead here in the first round of the 2014 NFL draft and draft themselves a quarterback?
Yeah, I mean, it could only help. Yeah, it's only going to help it. I mean, you're seeing what he's doing, where his stock is right now, playing with, just a litany of inconsistent, mediocre quarterback play. So, I mean, anything positive in the direction of building a stable franchise quarterback is only going to boost him even higher. There really is, no peak to where he can't reach right now. Definitely.
So, speaking of breakout second-year receivers, Alshon Jeffrey has stepped up in such a huge way. He's actually overtaken Brandon Marshall as the Bears' top pass catcher this season. Does it make a difference what quarterback is under center there in Chicago, or is Jeffrey a surefire stud moving forward regardless?
Yeah, he's still going to be in that top wide receiver 2 area for me, with wide receiver 1 upside each week. He was getting a little more targets with McCown than Cutler, but he still had monster games with Cutler too. So there's no reason to be scared off if Cutler comes back at all. So you're definitely going to keep plugging him out there. No brainer every week.
We're talking to Rich Hribar from xnsports.com right here on Fantasy Forecast Central. Rich, moving to the quarterback position and looking ahead to 2014, now that we have nearly 2 years of work to look back on, would you rather build a dynasty roster around Andrew Luck or Russell Wilson moving forward?
I mean, that's tough. I mean, you really can't go wrong, I don't think, in dynasty, whoever you choose. If you're making me pick, I'm going to lean Russell Wilson right now. You look at just the way he's developed, over the last 20 games he's been on the field has just been insane. The production he's getting. In the past 22 games he's played, he's thrown 41 touchdowns, only 9 interceptions. I mean, he's just 14 games with 2 touchdowns or more, 6 in a row. You get that extra 40 yards rushing game from, which is basically a passing touchdown. I mean, I'm gonna go with Russell Wilson if I have to choose, but I mean, Andrew Luck is still just 1B to me.
Yeah, when it comes to those two quarterbacks, obviously we're in the world of fantasy football. So when it comes to that, we're looking for fantasy points, and right now I have to agree with you. I have to lean towards Russell Wilson. Obviously, if I'm a general manager of an NFL team, I'm taking Andrew Luck all day long. But in the realm that we live in, fantasy points are what we live and die by. And right now, Russell Wilson just is absolutely on fire, and I would absolutely build my roster around him going forward. Rich, we got one last question before we let you go. We know you're a busy guy. Guys like Trent Richardson, Arian Foster, Ray Rice. These are all guys that were drafted in the top 10 this year and really haven't lived up to their pick, respectively, at all. Obviously, their stock will slide next year, leaving room for some new blood in the top 10. Who are some guys that you see moving into that top 10 territory in 2014? Is Zach Stacy maybe one of those guys?
Yeah, he's definitely in the area. I mean, if you look at the running back position the last few years, this happened last year too. If you go by ADP, only 4 of the top 12 running backs last year met top 12 criteria, and it's kind of happened again this year with a lot of guys sliding out there due to injuries and, all the other elements that come into factor. But I think we're looking for guys that are going to step up next year, depending on what happens with the Broncos situation. If Knowshon Moreno's back, he's going to be in that probably that first-round discussion. I think you're clearly looking at a lot more wide receivers, and then Gronk and Graham moving into that area too. So I think you're going to see a lot of running backs, kind of get scattered in the top 3 rounds this year. Gio Bernard is a guy I think people will kind of overrate like they did C.J. Spiller this year. I love Gio Bernard, but, he's really built to be in the role that he's in right now and is more effective in that role. You might see a guy like Eddie Lacy slide up there, based on what the Packers have done with him. And when Aaron Rodgers was healthy down that stretch, Eddie Lacy was the guy that they were leaning on with a lot of balance on offense. If you're looking for guys I think they're going to bust out too, that will leave owners, a little longing, I think you're looking at a guy like Ben Tate, people are going to overvalue next year, maybe even a guy like Andre Ellington. I think those guys are probably going to get pushed up in the offseason probably without due cause.
And you touched on, Rich, that last year only 4 of the top 12 ADP guys actually put up top 12 numbers. We as a whole, like a community, was sort of big on the whole running back, early running back, often late round QB type strategy as a whole. Who are maybe, the 4 or 5 running backs that you think next year are the guys that will hit that production, and you can feel safe picking them, in the top 5, in the top 8.
Yeah, the guys that you're going to trust are pretty much the guys that have done it, longer than a couple of years. We saw this year where we moved up a guy like Doug Martin or a guy like C.J. Spiller, into that group, and then we kept some guys a little longer like Aaron Foster and Ray Rice. I think you're looking at guys, like Adrian Peterson. It's going to be really hard not to touch, in that top area. Guys like Jamal Charles, Matt Forte, they just have a track record of just consistent production in their career, no matter what the volume that they've received in their offense has. Those are guys you're going to trust. You might see a guy like Reggie Bush lose more production, as Joey Bell, gets more involved. But yeah, I think that's what you're looking at is basically like those 3 guys, and everyone else is kind of be in like a gray area of and have red flags attached to them.
All right, Rich. That's all we have for you today. We appreciate you taking the time to come on the show, man, and talk some fantasy.
Yeah, definitely appreciate it. Hope we get a chance to do this again. Wish everyone luck in the playoffs. Hopefully it works out for you going forward the rest of the way.
Yeah, appreciate it. Good luck to you as well. That was Rich Hribar from xnsports.com.